For whatever reason, it's not advancing. I don't know if you have any suggestions, Paul. For whatever reason, slides are not advancing.
So make sure that the screen you're looking at should be Zoom at this point. So make sure you're in the Zoom format.
I believe I am.
Yeah. All right. Well, go back to PowerPoint. Try that. No? The other thing you can do is on the slide itself, right on Zoom, move your cursor on the slide, and there should be some arrows in the lower left-hand corner. Try clicking on one of those arrows.
There we go. Right. So I'll have to do it that way. So some of the key issues I want to talk about are what are the consequences of Rhode Island's existing solar siting programs? What are responsible solar siting objectives? What's the state versus the municipal role in solar siting? I want to talk a little bit about the municipal review process for those who may not fully understand how that works, how other states are managing solar development, and how you can advocate for solar siting reform. Rhode Island solar development policy has very good intentions, and unfortunately, it's had some unintended consequences that have yielded some bad results. And again, these were unintended. Certainly, people who worked on this didn't see any of this coming, but nonetheless, things haven't worked out necessarily as well as they could have. So what are some of these bad results? Well, unfortunately, it's been encouraging the development of some of Rhode Island's most important natural areas. Solar, in many cases, is outcompeting open space preservation. And I'm sure as the members of the Burrillville Land Trust are well aware, when you are approaching landowners right now, they can many times get significantly more money from solar developers than they can for selling their development rights. It's created some very severe community character conflicts. And lastly, forest loss has been an unintended consequence, and that's really counterproductive in managing for climate change. And I'm going to circle back and talk about that a lot more in a few minutes. So I'd like to start off with sort of the big picture. This is a map out of the state land use plan. This is the state's vision for how they'd like to grow in the future. What you're seeing here in that red pinkish area is the so-called urban services boundary. That's the area that's well served with existing infrastructure, public water, public sewer. There's denser development. It can be served by mass transportation. That's also the area, for the most part, that's going to be using most of the Rhode Island's energy, certainly now and in the future. And the state's vision is to encourage as much growth and redevelopment within that urban service boundary as reasonably possible. Outside the urban service boundary, the state isn't saying no growth. It's simply trying to say, let's grow smarter. Let's use more compact mixed use development so we can take development pressure off of our most important natural resources, which are all located outside that urban services boundary. That's where our public water supplies are located. That's where some of our best outdoor recreational areas are. And that's really where some of our best and most valuable habitat is located. Now I'd like to sort of compare and contrast two solar developments that happen around the same time. They have a very similar footprint, but they yielded very different results. This red rectangular area is showing you the approximate area that was cleared. It's about 60 acres. This is showing you what the forest looked like on your left before. The forest on the right is after clear cut. There was very significant site topography that was altered. There was ledge, there was blasting. As you can see, this is a very significant construction operation. The site was essentially leveled when they were done to make it ready for solar panels. At the conclusion, wetlands, apologize for the grainy picture. This is actually a photograph taken by a DEM enforcement individual. This comes right out of their enforcement report, and it's showing how wetlands were impacted by this solar development. There's supposed to be a 50-foot at least vegetated buffer between this wetland and development, and clearly you're not seeing that. According to the DEM official who visited this site, this wetland is now acting as a retention pond for the runoff that's coming off this site. When they were out there about almost 2 years after it was constructed, 2/3 of the site was yet to be vegetated. And as you can see, there's still a lot of rocky cobble material that's left over from the blasting. Now let's compare and contrast with another facility. Again, this is about 70 acres. It's in the city of East Providence, and they repurposed an old landfill. They worked very closely with DEM. They worked very closely with the solar developer. There's wetlands actually to the top of that slide. They were very careful not to impact the red maple swamp that's adjacent to this site. And as a result, it was a very successful project. We actually gave this project an award several years ago for being the first project in Rhode Island to successfully repurpose and reutilize a landfill for solar development. So, how can Rhode Island move forward, achieve our solar energy goals, and minimize impacts to natural areas? So, responsible solar siting that we're advocating would encourage solar very simply in developed and disturbed areas. It would also avoid and reduce loss of forests and natural areas. So these preferred locations, these developed and disturbed areas, are such areas as landfills, and according to DEM, Rhode Island has about 100 of them that would be suitable for solar development. Rooftops, these are residential rooftops. Massachusetts has already achieved approximately 40% of their solar goal on rooftops. Rhode Island is well below that number. Solar canopies and parking lots. This is something that we think has a lot of potential in Rhode Island. We're very pleased that the Public Utilities Commission has just put some additional funds to encourage this type of solar development in Rhode Island. Because let's face it, Rhode Island has an abundance of parking area and impervious parking lots that can be more effectively used. There are gravel banks, brownfields, business and industrial zone lands, existing fields, but not prime agricultural soils that can all be used. And anything with an asterisk just means it's going to cost more. We need to be upfront about that. And there will be a trade-off in some of these developed and disturbed areas. Development is more costly. So I'd like to take a look at what are some of the potential conflict areas. These are the areas that not only in Rhode Island, but really throughout the country that have created a lot of pushback for solar developers. They tend to be prime agricultural soils because people don't want to see good farmland taken out of food production, scenic views, historic and cultural resources, conservation opportunity areas, and in Rhode Island, those are defined by the state's Wildlife Action Plan as unfragmented forested areas that are 250 acres and greater, as well as unique and specialized habitat that would support rare and endangered species. And then when any of those above bullets intersect with a residential zone, that tends to be an area where communities are getting a lot of pushback for utility scale or large solar developments. So, what are the roles for trying to achieve responsible solar siting? From the state perspective, we've been advocating, along with many others, is that the state should provide incentives to encourage solar in developed and disturbed areas, and at the same time establish disincentives to discourage solar in our most important natural areas. The municipal role is to adopt a responsible solar siting ordinance, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So, how can municipalities reduce conflicts for solar development? Because quite frankly, towns, you're on the cutting edge right now. The state isn't taking a leadership role that other states have been taking, and they've been more or less delegating to towns to try to figure this out. First thing that towns need to do is prioritize solar in developed and disturbed areas. They can avoid and minimize impacts to natural, culture, and historic resources that they've previously identified as important to protect in their towns. So how do they do that? Well, the first thing that a town really needs to do is establish clear policies in their comprehensive plan. As you may know, in Rhode Island, all land use decisions must be consistent with the community's comprehensive plan. So in order to adopt responsible solar development, you have to make it clear where you want subsequent renewable energy and solar in your comp plan. Where you've established areas that have been developed and disturbed and you feel they're appropriate for solar, you should be allowing development of solar in these areas by right. That speeds up the process for the developer, provides certainty, and actually reduces their costs by avoiding sometimes a very costly and can be sort of a slower process of getting approval. Again, when you have areas that you feel are important to accommodate solar, such as a landfill or an old gravel bank, you need to increase the lot coverage to accommodate more development. If you have a good site, frankly, you want to maximize the use of that site. To put that into perspective, and particularly in residential zones where some of these abandoned landfills or old gravel banks might be, towns typically have a lot coverage requirement of as low as 5%. So if you have a good site, you certainly don't want to limit the site to only 5% lot coverage. So you want to increase that. You have to be flexible. And lastly, towns need to allow solar canopies. A lot of communities, ordinances that I've reviewed, have height restrictions of 10 feet, 12 feet, that the solar can't be any higher than that. And obviously that would preclude a solar canopy that has to be much higher. They can be typically 20 feet tall. And also they need to reference that solar canopy is an allowed use to encourage that in parking areas. So some responsible solar ordinance examples. I don't have time to get into the details, but South Kingstown, Exeter, Gloucester have all done a very good job. Many towns are finding that the first iteration of a solar ordinance that they adopt is not working. Gloucester, for example, went through 3 iterations. Exeter went through many revised ordinances until they found one that they liked. South Kingstown is in the process of revising theirs. So as towns learn more about this new land use for them, they're making adjustments and making changes. Last year, there was a state solar siting bill put in that I was involved in a stakeholder group in developing. The same bill has been put in this year. It's H7476. It's in the House. As far as I know, there's not a companion bill in the Senate yet. There's some good things and bad things about this bill. It does contain incentives, or at least a process to develop incentives to encourage solar in developed and disturbed areas. So we strongly support that. it's going to require the state to develop a renewable energy plan, which we think is extremely important. Right now, it's not clear how much renewable energy Rhode Island needs. What are the best sources of renewable energy? Where can that renewable energy be reasonably sited? How much of a land area will that take? And is it possible to bring renewable energy from other states? And what role is offshore wind going to play in all of this? So clearly the state needs a plan for how we want to move forward. The bill also tried to attempt to limit large solar projects in residential zones, and it established a 10 megawatt cap. To put that into perspective, that would be about a 50-acre footprint. It also attempted to limit solar in our best core forest and habitat to about 4 megawatts, or approximately 20-acre footprint. But unfortunately, there were loopholes in those provisions that would allow solar developers to really propose and get approved very significantly larger projects than that. Moreover, there was a clause in there that just didn't make any sense that would allow a town council to opt out of conditions 3 and 4, which essentially negated any limits for solar development in those areas. So instead, we've been proposing state renewable energy programs should not fund solar in our core forest, that's our most important, or important habitat areas.
Scott, there's a question from the audience, and I'll just read it the way it is. Much of the farming in Rhode Island is not about food, it's about growing turf. Citing solar portions on those farms would actually be better for the environment than growing turf. Wouldn't a more flexible policy on prime farmland financially help farmers and actually reduce pesticide loading and other impacts to the natural environment?
That's a good question. And I think all of this depends on scale. If we're going to be taking the entire turf field in its prime agricultural soil out of production for 25 years, I don't think that's in Rhode Island's best interest. The physical construction of a solar development compacts the soils. It could dramatically impact that soil for use as food production in the future. And that's not my opinion, that's talking to soil scientists who know a lot more about this than I do. But if a farmer wants to take one area of that farm and put in some solar, that certainly makes sense, and we certainly support that. But we'd like to guide it away from the prime agricultural soils to the extent that we can. Those are clearly our most important. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about property rights, because whenever I talk about the state limiting where solar development can go, people quickly talk about the issue of property rights. And would that be impacting people's property rights? So I want to make it very clear, and this is through discussions of numerous attorneys whose opinions I have a great deal of respect for. They've assured me that state incentive programs can clearly establish terms and conditions for eligibility. In fact, that's already happening. When you think about it, there really isn't any state or federal incentive program that doesn't have any strings attached. If anyone can think of one, please let me know, because I'd be very anxious to apply. For an example, Commerce Rhode Island has many incentive programs to encourage specific types of businesses. If I'm a business owner and my business doesn't qualify for one of their programs, it's not infringing upon my property rights. It's just that I didn't meet the terms and conditions for eligibility. And it also needs to be clear, the state would not be prohibiting solar development. Solar could still be developed in the areas we're encouraging the state not to provide incentives, but you'd have to do it with private funds, not using any of the state incentives that are currently in place. So there are a number of states that have already adopted very responsible solar siting programs. Again, I don't have time to go into all of these in detail. I've just found out today that Connecticut just went through their third iteration of solar siting, where they have removed indeed solar siting incentives from their core forest and their most important habitat areas. So that's essentially what we've been advocating for in Rhode Island. New Jersey has been doing that for a number of years, and so has Vermont. New Jersey is a good state to focus on. They've been encouraging most of their solar development in developed and disturbed areas. It's clearly working because they're one of the leaders nationwide in getting their electricity from solar development. I'd like to talk a little bit about the value of Rhode Island forests, because unfortunately forests have been sacrificed with some of the larger solar developments in Rhode Island. There was a report that I was a member of an advisory committee, and so was Paul Rosselli, that established what are the values of Rhode Island's forests. And there are, as you can see, there are many. There are clean air, and we shouldn't certainly take that for granted. 75% of our drinking water comes from forested watersheds. The economic value from our forest is frankly quite surprising. It's been well documented by a study that was just done at URI that it provides over 4,000 jobs that contribute over 700 million annually to Rhode Island's economy. I don't think many people knew and understood that. The forest really provides some of our best and most unique habitat. It's a source of tremendous outdoor recreation that I think most of us certainly enjoy. It has real value for human health, and clearly it has an important role to play in climate change mitigation. In fact, it's been determined that the forest is really the most economical climate change solution. Rhode Island has about over 300,000 acres of forest, and that can absorb the carbon emissions from over 100,000 cars annually. This carbon storage value has been determined by DEM to represent about $39 million each year. Forest preservation has been determined to be needed to achieve Rhode Island greenhouse gas reduction goals. That was determined in the Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan that was just developed several years ago. The forest is needed to absorb existing high levels of carbon. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people understand, that if we were to remove all subsequent greenhouse gas emissions today, if we could miraculously wave a magic wand and make that happen, we would still have elevated levels of carbon in the atmosphere that would need to be absorbed and removed to avoid the harmful impacts that climate change is already having. So the forest is clearly the only practical and economical way of absorbing that excess carbon. And URI just a couple of years ago determined that Rhode Island over the last 7 years has already lost about 2,000 acres of our most important core forest. That's pretty alarming. And this is just giving you an indication of where that core forest is. It's about 20% of Rhode Island's land area. The dark green area on this map has already been protected, thankfully, but the lighter green parcels, and again, these are parcels that are 250 acres and greater. They're not fragmented by house lots, power lines, roads. And in a densely urban state like Rhode Island, it's amazing that we still have this much unfragmented forest left. And again, it's been well documented. This is not only the most important habitat, this type of forest is the most important for carbon sequestration and storing that carbon long term. So when you look at a map like that, you think, wow, that the forest looks pretty healthy, it's intact. But what's really happening to that core forest is it's being fragmented. There's little holes being cut in that forest to make it begin to look like Swiss cheese. And that's if we leave the forest alone and keep it unfragmented, it's a very stable ecosystem that can literally last hundreds of years and provide really tremendous benefits to us. Once we start cutting holes in the forest, think of it as the beginning of the end. It begins to impact a lot of the functions and the values of the forest, and it's beginning to become degraded.
Scott, another question from
Sure.
one of our viewers, and I'll take the second part of this first, and then see where you go. What are the problems with siting large-scale solar projects in residential areas? Is it just about aesthetics, or are there other issues? And the viewer also wants to know if you're familiar with the solar farm on Beaver River Road in Richmond, and why there's so much local opposition to that.
The opposition in residential zones and the impacts really depend on the site. So I can't say for sure, but going back to one of those previous slides, if in that residential zone you're clear cutting core forest, you're going to be impacting important habitat. You're going to be degrading prime agricultural soils, impacting scenic views. That is going to generate significant pushback. And I think people need to realize, because I live in a rural town, a lot of people move to rural communities with the understanding that the area where they were going to move was certainly going to support more housing, but some of these larger solar developments are really an industrial use, which is not typically allowed in a residential zone, really in most rural and suburban towns. So that lies some of the pushback that you're getting. It's a use that people just don't think is consistent in many cases with their community comprehensive plan or the purposes of establishing these rural residential zoning districts. So that's been some of the big conflict. And Paul, can remind me about the second part of that question? I apologize.
Yep, sure. So I took it in the wrong order. The second part is, so large-scale solar projects in residential areas, is it just about aesthetics? And then the first part of it was the particular proposed solar farm on Beaver River Road in Richmond. But I think the two may be put together in the idea of what happens. Is it just aesthetics, or there are other issues involved with large-scale solar projects in residential areas?
Yeah, again, it's much more significant than aesthetics, and I think people that have been opposing some of these large projects, and I've gone to a lot of public hearings in a lot of different towns, have been labeled as NIMBYs, and it's unfortunate because I think they do have legitimate concerns, and they've been expressing themselves and being very articulate about what those concerns are. And as a result, I think town councils are listening. The project that I showed you at the beginning was in Western Cranston. Western Cranston established a moratorium. When that project was built, they didn't have an ordinance, which was frankly probably a big mistake. They do have an ordinance now, and the ordinance will not allow any subsequent large-scale solar in Western Cranston. So I think local officials are getting pushback. They're listening to people's concerns, and they're making adjustments accordingly. So I think that's a concern, and that's one of the reasons I want to see the state take a more active leadership role. We shouldn't be delegating to 39 cities and towns on how they want to accommodate solar. If the state is going to be encouraging solar in the areas that typically have the least amount of conflicts, these developed and disturbed areas, those tend to be more acceptable at the municipal level. If that begins to happen, we can actually accelerate solar development in Rhode Island. Instead of right now, we're sort of bogged down in contentious public hearings, lawsuits, and moratoria, which frankly isn't getting us very far. So what I wanted to do is talk about this pie diagram. This comes out of the Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan. And what it's showing you is the relative contribution in greenhouse gases of each sector. So for example, electricity consumption would produce about 20% of Rhode Island's annual greenhouse gas emissions, transportation 40%, residential 19%, et cetera. So if we achieve the governor's bold initiative of having Rhode Island attain 100% of our electricity from renewable sources at some point in the future, and let's hope that that's soon, it's only going to take about 20% of this pie diagram, which still leaves about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions that we need to mitigate some way. And frankly, that's going to be hard. It's transportation just by itself is going to be extremely difficult. I think we can all agree it's not going to happen anytime soon that all Rhode Islanders are driving electric vehicles, taking mass transportation, or walking everywhere. So it's going to take time. In the meantime, if we can stop cutting it down, the Rhode Island forest can absorb anywhere between 10 and 20% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions annually. So I think this illustrates how important it is to avoid continued forest loss. Paul asked me to talk about a little bit about local zoning and some of the local review steps. I'm going to go over this very quickly, and I'd have to admit that you could probably do an entire session just on this topic, so I apologize if I skip through this too quickly. But I'm going to go through a number of different scenarios and sort of give you a quick overview of what might be involved. And the first scenario would be a solar development needs a zone change. So a solar developer is coming to town, and let's say they want to build a 50-acre solar development. It's currently not allowed in zoning. The first process is that they make an application to the town council. The town council will send that to the planning board for an advisory opinion. They're going to be asking the planning board, is this zone change consistent with our community's comprehensive plan? The planning board will deliberate. They'll have a public meeting to discuss that. The public certainly has an opportunity to listen to those deliberations of the planning board, give your own feedback on what your thoughts might be. Every town has their comprehensive plan published, should be on the community website, easy to access. Once the planning board issues that advisory opinion, then the town council will hold a public hearing on the zone change. The town council, unfortunately, is not obligated to follow the planning board's advisory opinion. Again, it is advisory. The town council, after listening to testimony on for and against this particular zone change, can make a decision. They can reject the zone change out of hand. They can grant the petition for the zone change as is, or the town council can grant the zone change and establish very specific conditions without limitation. For example, in our 50-acre proposal, the town council, after listening to public comments, might say, well, 50 acres is too big. We want you to cut that size down to a size that might fit better within that residential or wherever that is going to be proposed. They could place conditions for greater buffer strips, vegetative screening, a better decommissioning plan. The list goes on and on. So if you're concerned about something that's coming in for proposed zone change, you probably have the opportunity for the most input into this process. Now let's take a look at another example. Let's assume there's a solar development. Let's say it's the same 50-acre proposal, but this time it's allowed by zoning, but it needs a special use permit. That means they have to apply to the zoning board for approval. The zoning board will hold a public hearing. Once again, the planning board has to issue an advisory opinion. Again, the zoning board is not obligated to follow that planning board advisory opinion. The zoning board will have a public hearing. They'll hear testimony on both sides of this, from the public, from the applicant. If this is happening in your town, you can certainly attend the public hearing and comment, express your concerns, give your comments on this particular project. But the zoning board also has the ability to deny the project. They can approve it as is, or they can approve and establish, again, site-specific conditions. They may not have the ability to reduce the footprint very significantly, but they can require greater buffers, vegetative screening, drill down into the more details on the decommissioning plan, etc. I think it's important to work collaboratively with the developer in this process. Honestly, it can be hard to deny a solar development if it's allowed as a special use. So it might be better to work collaboratively instead of antagonistically and not get any concessions or get any improvements to the project. And lastly, the same 50-acre solar development is allowed by right in zoning. This means all the developer really needs to do is follow the terms and standards that are laid out in the town's solar siting ordinance. In the event they do that, they're approved. The planning board would hold a site plan review. Each town can do this a little bit differently. There's something called a development plan review, or it could be a major land development project. The latter requires a public hearing, so there'd be more opportunity for public input. But again, if it's allowed by right in your zoning, you really can't stop this project. So again, you'd be wise to work collaboratively with the developer to try to get reasonable improvements. So what can you do to advocate for responsible solar siting? First thing you need to do is please contact your state legislative representatives. It's frustrating to me and many others who have been advocating for solar siting reforms for several years. And we hear from a number of key legislative leaders that they don't believe this is a problem. They don't believe it's a problem because they're not hearing it from you, their constituents. So it's really important to connect with them, make them aware that you believe this is an issue that demands their attention. It's a problem that needs to be resolved. Also, because this is an election year, you should know the positions of your town council candidates regarding responsible solar siting. Is this something where do they support reasonable, responsible solar siting, or are they going to sort of open the doors and allow large projects without any reasonable controls? Believe me, town council members do pay attention to their constituents. I live in Exeter. We had a town council that was advocating for very large solar development projects. They weren't listening to the concerns of the public. That entire town council was voted out of office in the next election. So politicians, elected officials do listen. And if they don't, they can suffer consequences during elections. So I've been talking a lot about this, going through a lot of things quickly. Let me just try to summarize some key points on responsible solar siting. First of all, we want to encourage solar again in developed and disturbed sites. We want to discourage solar in important natural cultural areas and prime agricultural soils. State solar programs should be revised for responsible solar siting. Right now, Rhode Island, quite frankly, is behind the curve. Other northeastern states are further ahead and are doing a much better job. And municipalities need to do exercise their land use authority and adopt the responsible solar siting ordinance. There's some really good models to choose from. The towns that I previously discussed, Exeter, South Kingstown, Gloucester, and others. And lastly, forest and renewable energy are both necessary to meet our climate change goals. I don't want anybody to misconstrue my presentation to think that in any way, I think that one is better than the other. Clearly, we need both if we're going to achieve our goals. And you need to advocate for responsible solar siting reform, because if you don't speak up, no one will hear you. I will stop there and entertain any questions you might have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Scott. If you can unshare your screen, I'm going to open up the floor. There are about 11, 12 of us still here, and open up the floor. If you want to ask a question to Scott, please do so by first unmuting your, if that's the right word, your microphone, and please ask away. We have a few minutes left before the end of our presentation for this evening. Who would like to ask a question? Everybody might be fiddling with their microphone, trying to figure it out.
No, from 1% to 2%. I'm okay.
Is there anybody here who would like to ask a question? Sounds like a few are having dinner. Well, I'll ask a question, and it's this comes actually from somebody, one of our viewers. So let me read it first. Okay, so how do you counter the landowner's position that they have the right to do what they want with their land? And if solar is denied, they will clear cut the forest for residential development instead. I think all of us have heard that many, many times. Scott, your microphone is on mute.
I might not have mentioned at the beginning, I own 45 acres of land myself, so I think I can relate to how large landowners are thinking about this. And frankly, I don't blame anyone for wanting to pursue the economic gain they can get from solar. Let's be honest, it's very lucrative for landowners. But people don't have the right to do whatever, because there is the rule of law and there is local zoning in towns that preclude large intensive land uses in residential zones. Zoning has been around for a very long time. I don't think there are very few landowners around that predate zoning, meaning that when they bought their property, they knew what the rules were. If they wanted to put in industrial and intensive uses, then perhaps they probably shouldn't have bought in a rural residential zone. When I bought my land, I knew that I was limited. Zoning does limit your uses, but I knew that firsthand when I purchased the property. And I think most landowners do. So that's how I would respond to that. And one other thing is that some landowners don't understand that what they do on their property impacts adjacent landowners. If I were to clear cut my 45 acres, I could be benefiting economically, but I'd be impacting everyone else in the community negatively.
Anyone else? I'll do a little follow-up to that question. So oftentimes the question is always, do you want solar development or do you want residential development? And I think one of the issues that many of us face is that comparison. Is it a fair comparison, first of all? And how do you talk about that rationally in front of somebody like a planning board or a landowner?
It's unfortunate that Rhode Island right now has a housing crisis. We don't have enough low and moderate income units to support our population. That's not good for Rhode Island. We can't grow our economy without reasonable places for people to live. And we're not talking about, and the kinds of units I'm talking about would be to support perhaps the entry-level teacher in your community, the police, the fire, the rescue workers, um, and, and, and young professionals. Entry to entry level jobs can't afford to live in Rhode Island, and that's not a good thing. In many cases, we're driving some good, talented young people away because they can't find housing. So I don't see housing as this terrible thing. And frankly, I've done a lot of work with conservation development that tends to cluster the homes on the most appropriate portions of the property. More than 50% of the land is protected in perpetuity. It blends in very nicely with existing community character. It preserves meaningful open space. It preserves forest and farm, again, in perpetuity. So I personally don't see residential development as being a negative. I think it needs to be a positive in communities, and it should be embraced.
Any other questions for Scott? So I'll ask another one if that's okay. So oftentimes we hear that of all these bad examples, and you pointed out one, development on a landfill. Are there other examples, and not just our own state in Rhode Island, but are there other examples where a community has embraced the idea of solar development in a very positive, natural, taking into account the natural environment? Is there some place that you can, if we drove someplace, Scott, besides the landfill, I think it was in East Providence.
Right. Well, actually,
another place.
For those who live in South County, you could drive no further than South Kingstown. They've been involved with two very cooperative projects, again, to repurpose two landfills. One, I believe, was even a Superfund site.
Yep.
It's worked very effectively. The people in the community seem to be they've embraced that development. They haven't received the pushback that they have received in other communities. South Kingstown is also one of the first towns that they put a solar canopy in a low and moderate income apartment complex. It's providing the residents of that complex more affordable electricity. And the thing I like about solar canopies is they tend to have a smaller footprint for the same amount of megawatts than does a conventional ground-mounted solar. So they tend to be a little more expensive, but they can use land more effectively and efficiently and take up a smaller footprint.
And I'm glad you talked about solar canopies. So one of the drawbacks that we hear from a lot of retail spaces is that they block the view. However, in Massachusetts, solar canopies are on retail parking lots, school grounds, drop-off and pick-up areas around schools. They provide solar. They provide not only the kilowatts, electricity, but shade, keep the rain and snow off the cars, and those types of things. So why is Rhode Island? Is it the incentives or the disincentives that are not promoting solar canopies? What is the holdback in our state?
Good question, Paul. I think solar canopies make a lot of sense. The deterrent has been the way the economic incentives are set up to encourage solar. The person who clear cuts a 50-acre forest gets the same amount of money who puts in solar canopies. Solar canopies are more expensive, thereby the payback is less. Developers are businessmen. They're trying to make the best profit they can. So other states have, New Jersey being one of the leaders, has really provided some very good economic incentives to encourage canopies. At Rutgers University, they have one of the biggest canopies in the country. It covers a massive parking lot. They have canopies along their walkways, so as students are walking back and forth to classes, they can stay out of the rain, they can stay out of the hot sun. Another thing I like about canopies is when we go to buy milk and bread and we want to charge our electric vehicles in the future, we can plug them in right at that canopy. So they can be dual purpose. So you can put charging stations right into these solar canopies. That could encourage, as more and more people are driving electric vehicles, having a harder place to find to charge them, that could be an incentive to visit business A versus business B, having the ability to charge up while you're shopping.
Great. I'm opening up the microphones just for the last 30 seconds or so. Does anybody have a burning question? Sounds like people are still having dinner. It's 7:30. I'm a firm believer of not only starting on time, but ending on time. I want to thank Scott Millar from GrowSmart, Rhode Island, for giving us his time and certainly his expertise, not only in this presentation, but so many others all across the state and elsewhere. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody. There are more events and presentations that will take place all during the month of April. Check out the Burrillville Land Trust Facebook page. And as of tomorrow, you can check out the Burrillville Land Trust website for more information. Thank you all and good night. Hold on, Scott. There you go. Go ahead, Scott.
I just want to say, Paul, thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and thank you all for listening.
All right. Thanks again, Scott. Good night, everybody.